Ethan never thought much about shadows. To him, they were just a natural part of light, something that followed objects stretched across walls and disappeared the moment the light source was gone. They had no meaning, no presence of their own. They were simply reflections of something real. That belief lasted until the night his shadow didn't disappear. It started in the most ordinary way. Ethan had just moved into a new apartment, a small but comfortable space on the third floor of an older building. The place had character, slightly creaky floors, dim lighting in the hallways, and large windows that let in just enough light during the day. At night, though, the apartment felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, heavier, as if they held on to the darkness longer than they should. Still, nothing about it felt threatening. Not at first. On his second night there, Ethan was unpacking in the living room. A single lamp stood in the corner, casting a warm but limited glow across the space. Boxes were scattered around him, half open, their contents spilling out onto the floor. His shadow stretched along the wall, long and slightly distorted, moving with him as he worked. Everything was normal, until he turned off the light. The room dropped into darkness instantly. Ethan stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. The faint glow from outside filtered through the curtains, just enough to outline the shapes of the furniture. He turned to leave the room, but something made him stop. There was still a shadow on the wall. He frowned, blinking as he tried to make sense of it. The shape was faint, barely visible, but it was there. A dark outline standing exactly where his shadow had been moments before. Ethan didn't move. The shadow didn't either. A small, uneasy feeling settled in his chest. He glanced around, searching for another light source, something that could explain it. Maybe the streetlight outside was casting a faint reflection. Maybe it was just his eyes playing tricks on him. Trying to stay calm, he reached for the lamp and turned it back on. The room filled with light again, and his shadow snapped back into place, perfectly aligned with his movements. Ethan let out a quiet breath and shook his head. "Just your imagination," he muttered. He turned the lamp off again. Darkness returned, and the shadow stayed. This time it was clearer, sharper, more defined. Ethan felt his pulse quicken slightly as he stared at it. The outline was unmistakable. It was his. Same height, same posture, same shape. But something about it felt wrong. Slowly he raised his hand. The shadow didn't move. A cold wave of realization washed over him as he held his hand in the air, watching the still figure on the wall. His breathing grew shallow, his mind racing for an explanation that didn't come. "This isn't real," he whispered. The shadow tilted its head. Ethan's heart slammed against his chest as he stumbled back, his hand dropping instantly. The movement was subtle, but it was there. The shadow had reacted, not to him, on its own. He turned the lamp back on quickly, flooding the room with light. His shadow snapped back into place again, moving perfectly in sync with him as if nothing had happened. Ethan stood there, frozen, staring at the wall. For a long time he didn't move. That night he left the lights on. Every single one. The apartment glowed unnaturally bright, every corner illuminated, every shadow minimized. Ethan stayed awake, sitting on his couch, his eyes constantly drifting toward the walls, checking, watching. Nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion pulled him into a restless sleep. The next night, he tried to convince himself it had been a one-time thing. Stress, lack of sleep, a trick of the mind. He couldn't live in constant fear of something that didn't make sense, so he turned off the lights again. And the shadow returned. This time, it didn't stay still. Ethan watched as it shifted slightly, its edges stretching unnaturally across the wall. It didn't match his position anymore. It stood just a little to the side, like it had taken a step away from him. "No," he whispered, backing up. The shadow moved again, slowly, deliberately. It was no longer copying him. It was moving on its own. Ethan turned the light back on immediately, his hands shaking slightly now. The shadow snapped back into place once more, perfectly aligned, as if it had never moved at all. But Ethan knew what he had seen, and now he couldn't unsee it. Over the next few nights, the pattern continued. Every time the lights went off, the shadow remained, and each time, it did a little more. At first, it only moved slightly, small shifts, subtle changes. Then it began to drift further, separating itself from him completely. It no longer needed him to exist. It had become something else, something independent. Ethan stopped sleeping. He kept the lights on constantly, terrified of what would happen if he didn't. But even that began to feel pointless because the shadow started to change, even in the light. Sometimes, when he wasn't looking directly at it, he would catch it moving in the corner of his eye. Sometimes it didn't quite match his movements anymore. And sometimes, it looked like it was watching him. One night, the power went out. The apartment fell into complete darkness. Ethan's breath caught as panic surged through him. He fumbled for his phone, trying to turn on the flashlight, but before he could, he saw it. The shadow stood in front of him. Not on the wall, not stretched or distorted, standing, solid, separate. It had a shape, but it wasn't flat anymore. It had depth, presence, something real. It moved slightly, its form shifting as if adjusting to its new state. Ethan couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadow took a step closer, and then, in a voice that sounded like his, but not quite, it spoke. "You're in the light now." Ethan's mind struggled to understand the words, to make sense of what they meant, but before he could react, the shadow moved again, faster this time. The darkness around him seemed to stretch, pulling away from him, wrapping around the figure instead. And then, the lights came back on. Ethan stood in the middle of the room, alone. The walls were empty. No shadow, nothing. At first he felt relief, then confusion. He looked down slowly, and his breath stopped. There was no shadow beneath him. No matter how the light hit him, no matter where he stood, there was nothing there. And somewhere behind him, just out of sight, a shadow moved, its mythic murmurs